186 Gwyder Street in Cambridge was bought by David Parr, a working-class decorative artist, in 1886. Over the next 40 years, Parr slowly decorated his home in the style of the grand interiors he worked on every day. After David Parr's death in 1927, his granddaughter Elsie Palmer came to live in the house and stayed for the next 85 years, preserving the house in its original state as best she could. In 2014, a charity was set up to save the house as a museum. Parts of the house had very well conserved wall decoration, and other areas were badly deteriorating due to damp. So began a 2.5-year project to conserve and stabilise the precious interior. A useful reference was David Parr's very detailed notebook, recording all his work in the house. A team of experts were employed, from conservation specialists to paint analysts, joiners to painters, wallpaper experts to specialist painters and art decorators. The first job was to re-roof the property and stop the rain from damaging the interior. Then, the exterior brickwork, which had been repointed with cement, had to now be repointed using lime mortar.
This is one of the most unusual projects I think we've ever worked on, in that it's such an odd survival, and just to have it hidden away in a little street in Cambridge.
Tobit Curtis is a specialist in the investigation, monitoring and control of environmental deterioration and the conservation of wall paintings.
The biggest problem is actually that the building has deteriorated over many years, and so the pointing was damaged, the drain pipes were damaged, so a lot of water got in. And when you have water in a building like this, it dissolves a lot of the materials that are in the bricks and in the cement and produces salts. And salts then grow and come out of the wall and force the paint layer off. The paint layer is non-porous, so they can't get through it. A lot of the conservation work is actually quite simple because Parr's technique was extremely good, but there's been an accumulation of dirt and dust over the surface, so we're cleaning the surface very carefully. Generally, we're cleaning it with vulcanized rubber sponges, which just softly roll away the dirt particles from the surface without affecting the paint layer.
As well as the delicate paintwork, there is more structural work to do, such as the sash windows.
Well, I've removed the staff beads which were screwed on this window. I'm going to cut the cords that will allow me to take the bottom sash out so that I can then gain access to the top sash.
In order to conserve each window, Bob removes the top and bottom sashes and gently sands them. The weights and pulleys within each frame must be checked and the cords replaced. It is a tricky and skilled job, and it takes Bob 3 weeks to complete the work to the windows, including the repair or replacement of several rotten windowsills. Work is also being done at the Hamilton Carr Institute, a department of the Fitzwilliam Museum specialising in paint conservation. Emma Jansen is working on the analysis of David Parr's paints.
We spent a few days at David Parr House, taking paint samples from almost every single painted surface in the house, including all of the interior rooms, as well as the exterior, which is the sample we're looking at here. And from that, we collected the samples, which are essentially small paint chips, and we brought them back to our lab here at the Hamilton Carr Institute. And interestingly, for this paint sample, which is taken from a black part of the frieze, we can refer to what David Parr says about the original green pigment he used. So the writing is a little bit fuzzy for me, but it says here that the green he used for the frieze is mineral. And then he's annotated that entry, and it also says, which soon changed to nearly black. So we know from the notebook that David Parr himself observed that this green pigment turned to black nearly immediately. So he's very aware of the materials he's using, and he's constantly trying to improve his methods.
Emma has collected almost 200 paint samples from all the rooms in the David Parr house. The paint samples and findings are analysed by Emma under the supervision of Dr. Spike Bucklow.
So this is the sample from that very dark enamel-y type green in the drawing room, and we were interested to know whether there was an original David Parr scheme underneath that brighter green. So this is the sample we took, and it's got this sort of lighter yellowish green underneath that dark green.
I was looking for maybe iron to go see if that was Prussian blue. I expected something maybe like arsenic up here, and it certainly isn't. But the weird thing was that this area, this bright area here, indicates a lot of titanium. And I wasn't expecting that at all. Titanium's in the wrong date range, in that it would be kind of unlikely to expect it before 1920. And we're... Yeah. But it does mean that we've given David Parr House all the information that science can deliver, and then we can guide them in options, but they'll have to use their discretion and interpret the data that we've got.
Back at the house, Tobit's team are now retouching the paintwork in the back rooms.
People tend to see conservators on site with scalpels and swabs and chemicals, and they think of that as the conservation part of the project. But of course, that is just one small element. That element, which is probably the most intense bit, is for about 6 weeks of us, and then we have some other specialists doing some recreation of lost areas coming in. So you're talking a small handful of months. But the lead up to that has been 2 or 3 years. The lead on from that will be as long as the house survives. You never finish a conservation project. It just differs in levels of intensity.
The front room is being sealed off from any dust, as the work there is about to start. This room will first need to be plastered and allowed to dry out before any of the painting restoration can begin. Simon Swan is a specialist conservator of stone and plasterwork.
The overall aim is to lime plaster this wall, which will be in 3 or 4 coats in the end. So what we're doing today is the first coat, which is the render coat, and we're using haired lime plaster as the first coat. So obviously the issue we have is keeping everything as dry as possible, but lime plaster of course needs lots of water in the background before we can make it work. So we're sort of very carefully wetting down the background just then, and then we apply the plaster. We've done a little bit of edge preparation on the old edges, and then we're carefully applying in fairly small quantities the lime plaster, because we have to be very careful of the historic fabric all around, and especially the painted surfaces above.
Simon is using hot lime mix mortar to maintain the wall's permeability. He's added hair and fibre to the mix to identify his work as a modern addition to the house. Primer solution is also applied to help the plaster adhere to the edges, as getting the edging right is crucial. Between each coat, the plaster must be cross-hatched to provide a key for the next coat. And there are numerous walls to be lime plastered.
Cement does not breathe. In these old buildings, which have been a lot of problems over the years, people have gone to these old buildings, replaced the plaster, with sand, cement and other materials, like paper materials, which don't breathe and cause damp, which traps all the moisture in the wall. Lime breathes. So what happens is with the lime, as long as it's not overtrailed, the wall breathes all the way through and can dry out naturally.
This replastering using lime requires very specialist skill, as the lime is tricky to work with and sets slowly. The front room has now had its final fine coat of plaster and is ready to be painted. Saskia Hunning is a specialist decorator and painter and was employed by David Parr House to recreate the areas of painting on the walls that had been damaged. In the drawing room, the whole front wall had been damaged and had to be totally repainted, copying David Parr's patterns.
When I'm looking at a project and I've got to work out how long it's going to take, which is one of the most difficult things, I will look at the design and work out how many colours there are and roughly work out the process by which I'll paint it. For example, I think it needs 3 coats on a base on the ground, and then there's 5 or 6 colours to work in. So I work out roughly how long it's going to take. Then when I'm on site for the project, I will do a couple of colour mixing days. So I play around with colours, so I know roughly what I'll need, and I'll do some sample cards, sort of building up layers of colour.
To reproduce the intricate patterns accurately is painstaking work, and Saskia uses an old traditional method of transferring patterns called pouncing, which David Parr himself also used. After tracing every line of the original pattern onto tracing paper, she then uses a pin to prick along all the lines on the pattern at small, regular intervals. Back in the drawing room, she carefully attaches the tracing paper to the wall.
I'm pouncing the design onto the wall, so I've got my pouncing bag full of newspaper ash, and I'm tapping it so that I make sure I get enough through the little pinpricked holes in the pouncing sheet. Then my next thing to do is because it's a very complicated design and it's got all sorts of leaves and stalks, I do use a very fine, one of the sable liners with a raw umber wash, just to line out those little dotted lines. So I have the whole design on the wall as little painted lines. Then I start filling in with the colours. The most challenging is probably getting the ground colour right, because if you start off with the wrong ground colour, you've sort of had it. If it's too dark, you'll never get the right translucency and sort of colour glowing through. When I've got all the colours and worked out how my patination is working, and I've crept it out of the corner a bit onto the main wall, then it just is paint, 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 as efficiently and quickly as possible.
I think if you're visiting Cambridge, you see a 21st century city full of wonderful architectural heritage, but you tend to see the grand surface of a lot of the buildings, and it's very rare to have a window into the lives that were behind that. At the David Parr House, you walk through the door and you are immediately thrown into the life of one of the people who created some of those great buildings, but in a way which is almost unique. There really is very little else like it.